welcome to the Philanthropy's October workshop. We're going to talk today about gating budgets for donor proposals. But first, a little bit about the Institute of Philanthropy. We exist, which I just love, to help nonprofits significantly increase their fundraising capabilities and the impact they have on their communities and society. And what that means is that my job as director of the Institute is to go out into the community and hear, of course, online, which is our community these days, and work with my fellow colleagues in the nonprofit sector about fundraising, how to do it better, how they are doing it, how I might suggest they do it, all for low cost or free. So that really brings me a lot of satisfaction, and I hope to find out soon enough, once we get through this, how well I've succeeded. So a little bit more about me. One of the reasons I am so pleased to be able to do this kind of work is that I was a fundraiser myself for quite some time. I've been in nonprofit fundraising for more than 20 years now, which is a little bit scary, and spent also the past nearly 10 years in education, teaching adult students the graduate, undergraduate level in fundraising and financial management. So you can see a little bit more about me here on the screen. I have a couple of degrees that have just left me with a lot of debt, which I'm sure you can all relate to. But I've been with the Institute of Philanthropy for almost 3 years now. So hooray, I'm getting my feet wet. And let's move on to our presentation. But first, if you could, I would love for you all to introduce yourselves in the chat box and tell us your name, your affiliation, whether you're with a nonprofit or a university or whatever. And then just to have some fun, let's tell us what your favorite Halloween candy is. I was forced to admit last week that mine is candy corn, which apparently has a bad rap these days. So I've put myself out there and made myself vulnerable. Let's see what y'all think. Your name, your affiliation, and your favorite Halloween candy. And we'll get going with our presentation. So I'm going to share this screen. All right, some basics at first. What is a budget? What is a budget? If you're not typing about candy, why don't you shout out in the chat box what it is? We've got peanut butter cups, Snickers. I love Snickers too. Reese's peanut butter cups also. So what is a budget really? I know there's some from teaching financial management. I know that some people, not all, some people do get a little squirrely when they think they have to budget or they have to talk about it or whatever. So I'm here to tell you, in case, it's slipped your mind or you haven't really thought about it in this way, that a budget is a plan. It's attaching numbers to your plan for your program, your organization, whatever you happen to be budgeting for. And as such, it is flexible, or should be. It is fluid, and it involves some, I hate to say guessing, but projecting totals, doing some research and making educated guesses about what things are going to cost or what you might be able to bring in. And for that reason, I always try to tell people, in case they're anxious, this is a plan, and plans change according to what's going on with circumstances outside your control, what changes happen in your organization, what changes your donor might want to see, etc. So it's all right to put it down on paper and know that it's going to change. Know that you're doing the best you can with the information you have at hand right now, and go forward. So the first thing I want to point out is that before you start crunching your numbers, there's some questions you want to ask yourself. So who is the budget for, right? Often, I say one size does not fit all, because often you are fortunate enough to be able to have your finance office run off whatever is in their system for your program You can take it and give it to the donor and everybody's happy. But as those of you who have been in this business for any length of time know, one size does not fit all. There's going to be some translation needed. We'll get to that down further down the slide. And we're going to have to work with what the donor requires to craft a budget accordingly. For grants, this means checking for what are allowable costs. And these are always published in their guidelines. A lot of grantors will not fund entertainment, for example, or events or sponsorships if we're talking about foundations for something. So check that first. And the same section will also indicate to you whether or not the donor will support all costs or only direct costs, which we get to a little bit later in the presentation. So the information you come up with is going to tell you, do I need to create a budget myself or adapt one from the program finance office? And I think it's important to note that this is not only going to be in play when you have to figure out what the donor wants, but it also is in play when the program, depending on how far along the program is. Um, and I bet there's a lot of people out there like myself who have had to sit down with a program manager at the very inception of a new program and say, okay, we got to create a budget so I can go and apply for money for this, right? Or that I can show this to our major donors who you want to give you seed money. So you actually end up being the person who creates that budget because it's driven by the fundraising time schedule. Coming back to what I should include, do I get to include full program costs, both direct and indirect, or direct costs only? Then we talk about translating your finance office budget into categories. And this is a real art for us fundraisers because often they're not the same. And I've got a couple examples for you. Common grant application form. If you're in the Puget Sound area, you know that this is used by many funders in our area. And I went to look it up because I was curious about their budget format, and they don't have one. The budget is an attachment that you submit with your proposal. And so this is one of those happy circumstances where you can take your own budget and send it to them, making sure that the only allowable costs are included, but you don't have to reformat it. You don't have to translate your categories into theirs, right? Then we have this one from the Siouxland Community Foundation. Can everybody see it? And it is divided into revenue and expense, of course. You see here local, state, federal government, for foundations, corporations, individual fundraising. What's not in here? There are no events, right? There's no earned revenue. They're assuming that all your revenue comes from contributions or contracts. Then down expenses, salaries, rent, fees, land and building acquisition, which equipment, supplies, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's a relatively standard, I would say, budget format that you would have to take your own and say your finance folks call rent facilities expense. Well, you have to figure that out, go in, portion out rent, utilities, phone, and fax, and put it in on this line. Okay. Next example is a little bit more, even more complex. This is the Dyson Foundation, and this project budget is a 3-year, possibly a 3-year budget for multi-year requests. They include their own requests, and I had someone talking to me earlier today where the budget they were working on was you were not allowed to include your requests to the foundation. So this is also something to look for. Government grants where you list them, other foundations where you list them, and we'll talk about what to include and how to include it in the revenue section of this discussion.
Hey, Angela, it looks like
Corporations, federal funds, United. Now these folks.
we can't see what you're sharing. We can only see the PowerPoint.
Uh-oh. Okay. Oh dear. Okay. I guess I have to stop the share. I'm sorry, folks. Let's stop this share. Look at this quickly again. This is can you see it now? So this is the first grant application budget I was talking about, with no events in the revenue, no earned income, and then project expenses that were split out, and the possible demarcation, the rent utilities organization, for example, construction equipment supplies. A lot of these are pretty standard, but who knows what your finance office calls them, right? So I'm gonna stop this share and show you the little bit more complicated one that we were on. This is the Dyson Foundation, and it has the option of multi-year funding. Up here, you can see there's 3 years worth of budgeting that are possible with your request to the foundation included. Government grants, which are listed out, other foundations that we'll talk about in our revenue discussion, corporations, individuals, events, some earned income in here, fees, except for example, membership income. And you could include your own, say you're a school and you charge tuition, or you're an arts organization and you sell tickets, okay? Down here with expenses, again, projecting out 3 years if you're making a multi-year request. Salaries and wages, fringes, split out here. Consultants and professional fees, equipment. So they have fewer expense categories here than the last budget did. So you would again have to figure out a way to collapse your own into this format, okay? I'm gonna stop this share and go back to the PowerPoint. So we've looked at some examples of that. And the last point on this slide is certainly not the least. There must be a way for you to annotate your budgets. The next person can come in and know exactly what you did when you did your calculations, okay? And I think it's important to know that you want to include the input. What is the item, for example, hourly rate? What is the rate, say $25 an hour? And what's the quantity? 40 hours a week for 6 weeks, and you do all the calculations for that, okay? It's really important, folks, that even yourself, if you're preparing a budget in January and you need to report on it the following June, 18 months later, you might go back and say, how did I get this number? So take notes, and good ones, and you can put them in the Excel, or you can create a file for a narrative, which you may have to write for the proposal or explain to your donor anyhow, right? So that's super important. All right, let's do a poll. And I'm interested in knowing from those of you who are out in the field, where funders are when it comes to funding the full cost of a proposal. Are you finding that they're willing to cover full costs or direct costs only? Go ahead and click one of the answers and we'll see what we come up with. So far, 100% direct costs. There's no one out there who's willing to consider full program support still. Okay. Anyone else have something to say and restore my faith in philanthropy? Okay, well, we'll proceed assuming that direct costs is still the mode du jour. And right now you can see 3 all direct costs in there. You can see the results there. So I'm gonna go back to my PowerPoint. And we will go forward with an optimistic approach that indirect costs are important. They're going to become more important, and we need to know how to calculate them and share them with our funders as we continue to So getting down to it, these are the components of proposal budget, and I took these when I was doing federal grants from the categories that were in there because in my experience, they were broad enough to help me know what bucket to deposit things into, um, and still be able to justify it to the funder. So another note about budgeting is that there is no one accepted or correct way to do your line items or to do your categories. They're really kind of dependent on your own organization's accounting system and finance system, et cetera. So these are mine, and you can take them or leave them or adapt them as you will. Under revenue, there's contributed and earned. So we're going to want to think about all the different sources of contributed revenue, government, foundation, corporation, individuals, and event revenue, and then the earned revenue. And this was again when I was in the arts. So that would have included admission, tuition at the school, and fees. There are other organizations who rent their space, for example, and that's where you would put that as if you could justify counting it towards your program. Um, investment income, you could put under earned. And the organization's cash, which we sometimes do include. Um, remember that government grants are reimbursable. Those you guys probably know that very well already. But what that means is that you will not be paid until the project is finished. So you do need to show in your budget that you have the capacity to begin the program through other sources of contributions or your own cash, and that a reimbursement system at the end of the project will work for you. Okay. Under expenses, direct, we have salaries and wages. These are people who are employed by your organization. Fringes are their benefits, and you'll find in most organizations that there is often a calculation that has been made for certain categories of employee as to what the percentage of their base salary is in their fringes, okay? Their benefits, if you will. And so it's kind of easy to go to the finance folks and say, hey, what's the rate for our stagehands? And they can tell you. Fees are consultants and people or things like a royalty fee or a design fee or some kind of one-time payment that is not directed at an employee. Supplies and materials ends up being a little bit of a catch-all, and your donor may require more information or more specific categories for that. And then travel, and this is both local and domestic, international. If you're in the business where you have folks flying in to teach for you or to choreograph for you or whatever, right? And then indirect costs are administration, and we'll talk quite a bit about those in just a few minutes. Any questions so far? I tend to get on a roll about this stuff because I like it. So if there are no questions, we'll go on. Okay. On a note on costs, if you're new to budgeting, or if you're a little bit of a type A person like me that wants everything to be perfect, you might tend to want to separate out everything, just for the sake of accuracy, because you want to be honest and do a good job and you have integrity. But sometimes you have to weigh the costs of doing that against the benefits. So, for example, you have to decide how far in the weeds you want to get and what kind of support you have in your organization for that. Some organizations are sophisticated enough that they have time cards and they have codes on their copying machine, and they keep records of what program everything should be billed to. So when it comes time to split out those costs, they have all the information right at hand. Others don't. Um, and you might have to go and use a job description to figure out how much time somebody spends on a particular program, or sit down with them directly and say, okay, how much time do you spend on education programs? How much time do you spend on outreach? And use their estimates to calculate how much they're wages are costing for this particular program, okay? When categories are unclear, for you don't know where to put something in your budget, I would call the donor and I would say, hey, we want to do a really good job for you. Can you let me know where you would like to see this? Okay, moving on.
Yeah,
Do we have a
it looks like we
question?
have a question, Angela. Somebody asks, how do you
Yeah,
determine
okay.
guidelines for those income/revenue buckets by percentage for a new organization?
Brand new, I think you're going to have to go I would go on your plans. So what's the organization's mission? Say to produce widgets. I'm going to use a for-profit example. If everybody on the team is 100% towards producing widgets, then you can obviously allocate 100% of the organization's cost to that. I know it's more complicated than that. Why don't, Carmen, we come back to this after we go through direct and indirect, and then maybe you can think about how much of your new organization the founder or the director is going to dedicate to administration versus programs, which is really the biggest expense in nonprofits, their personnel. So why don't we come back to that? And if you don't get answers in this, I can help you afterwards, okay? Um, and I'm going to turn off my video because the bandwidth is low. So stop video. Okay. Next, moving on, direct and indirect costs. I'm sure most of you know what these are. Direct costs are the activities or items associated entirely with the project or program. So here are some examples. Indirect costs include items associated with running the organization as a whole, but those do not apply to the program in question, okay? These can be your IT folks, your finance folks, your HR folks, your rent, your insurance, etc. And there are ways to allocate those costs if you are in fact able to count them in your budget. So let's move on to that. For starting, let's start with a direct cost example. I use this one a lot when I teach financial management. Homelessness and shelters are kind of one of my, is it right to say pets? But when it's an unfortunate thing like that, but you know what I mean. Moving ahead, we've got a fictitious shelter with a soup kitchen in it, okay? The nonprofit administration is also housed in the same facility. So using our expense categories, which I put over here on the right side of the screen, what are some direct costs and what category might they fall under? Type it out, don't be shy. I've put some examples on the screen for you right here. So if we're thinking about a shelter, what does it take to run a shelter? Well, we need a manager, and that person is paid a salary and benefits, we hope, right? We need to have food for the soup kitchen. We need laundry costs for washing the bedding that they use, okay? Those are all direct costs, and you would want to include them with your calculations and your annotations in your budget. Any questions about that? I think this is the easy one. Okay. Everybody clear on what categories they would go under? Wages. I would put food and laundry costs into supplies and material, right? Because these are supplies that you need to deliver on your mission. Moving on. Come on. There we go. Indirect costs. This is also called overhead. Indirect costs are items that are associated with running the organization as a whole. And we've already talked about some, like I said, your IT folks, your finance folks who might order supplies for your shelter, but don't run it directly. Your insurance for your building, your rent, which can be split up, right? And how we go about doing this is we allocate the costs. Cost allocation is applied only to indirect cost items. Why is that? Any guesses? Well, direct cost is 100%, right? We don't have to split them up necessarily because they are fully a cost of doing business with one particular program. Indirect cost items spread across the organization, so they do have to be allocated. And how this is done is using an appropriate cost driver. And at the end of this, I've got a slide of resources. There's an excellent publication about every step that you use to allocate using a cost driver and assigning those costs. And their guiding question, which made a lot of sense to me, was how do we meaningfully distribute the cost of X across programs? That is choosing, because you get to choose it, an appropriate cost driver. And I have an example of this next, okay? So some examples of cost items for our shelter would be the finance staff and the rent. Everybody with me so far? I see a question in the chat box. Or a yes, even better. Okay, great. All right, so let's have an example of this. Looking at allocating our rent expense, we're back to our shelter, okay? Now, our cost item is the rent. And let's say for the purposes of discussion, it's $1,000 a month. Wouldn't that be a great thing to have, right? The cost driver, or what we're going to use to split this rent cost up, is the square footage, or for ease of calculation here, I put percentage of the facility that's being used by program. Okay, so in our shelter, the shelter itself, lovely pie over here, is 60% takes up 60% of the building. Okay, the soup kitchen in green takes up 30%, and the admin in black for Halloween is 10%. So when you allocate the rent expense of $1,000 a month, it will come out $600 for the shelter, $300 for the kitchen, and $100 for the admin. I apologize for my little tweenie there in their playpen, but still doing a little barking. I'm sorry about that. So does this make sense how this is allocated and what you need in place? You need your cost item, your cost driver. And this is also the kind of thing you put in your budget notes, right? For the rent, I am using percent of square footage and coming out with these figures. Everybody clear? Okay. Now, that is expenses. Any questions on expenses before we move on to revenue? So, no, not yet. So Carmen, did that help with your question? Or do we need words about a new organization? Okay, well, let's chat afterwards, or I can give you a call or however to help you try to figure that out, okay? Okay. So next we move on to revenue. And when I teach this course of financial management, the biggest mistake the students make are not including revenue in their budget. They're very focused on expenses, getting them right, accurate, including everything, so much so that they forget that they have to show the revenue side too, okay? Forecasting revenue is an art that has a little science underpinning, right? Because donors are even less predictable than our vendors or information we can find out about how much something's going to cost to purchase, right? So the first thing to do is to consult your development plan and the prospect research you're doing, okay? All those revenue lines, I'm going to skip around a little bit here. Each of these in your revenue categories, you'll be at a certain place in when you are preparing a budget. You might be preparing it a year and a half ahead of time for some of the government agencies, right? Or the larger foundations. And then for individuals, you may only have to prepare a budget to the point that you're showing them how much what they want to fund is going to cost the organization as opposed to the entire program, or talking to them about it in one of your visits or your major gift officers talking to them about it. So you may be way out where your plans are not yet solidified, or close as you get closer to the event, knowing how much you're going to raise, how much you plan to raise, and from what sources you plan to solicit it become clearer. I'm here to tell you, if you don't know this already, that donors, especially government and foundation who require this budget so far in advance, they get that, okay? So as long as it shows in your numbers that you have put in done your research to the point that it's possible, they aren't going to, you don't have to be as worried when things change. If a certain donor doesn't come through, or if a certain donor appears on the horizon after you've submitted the application, they get it, and that's going to be okay. You just need to keep your donor in the loop as to what happens, right? So, whoops, going backwards. So include all categories and sources of revenue that you plan to solicit or bring in the case of your earned revenue, whether confirmed, in process, or planned. The trick is noting it, okay? So on the budget form that we saw, there were spaces, as you remember, where you could write, the specific name of the foundation or the specific source of revenue. The words confirmed, pending, or planned are what's going to make this work for you, okay? So in the early stages, you'll have a lot of in process or planned. That's okay. The donor wants to see that you are not putting all your eggs in one basket, that their gift isn't the only one that is planned for this project, right? Why is that? Anyone? Do we ask donors to fund 100% of our project? We do not. Why is that? Well, it's not sustainable, okay? Donors do not want to feel like if they stop making their gift, that the program goes away, because what happens to the clients, right? What about those services that they need? Bye-bye, right? If you're putting all your eggs in that one donor basket. So a diversity of revenue sources is really important in your budget to show the donor you're approaching, and in fact, any donor, that you are committed to this project, that there's support in the community for it is demonstrated by gifts, and that the project is going to be sustainable beyond the life of whatever gift you're asking for. Okay? Is that clear to everybody? Is that spooking any of you? Thank you, Suzanne. So far seems to be clear to everyone. So let's look at some of those revenue categories and think about what would make sense in light of our example to include in our budget. Okay, we're back with our shelter. Remember, it's a shelter, a soup kitchen, and administration. All right, so I just did some imagining based on the reality that I know, if you will. And in my fictitious shelter, there is a awesome fictitious development director who has a fundraising plan for this project. And thinking about who might fund shelters, well, a lot of human services are funded heavily by government. So government is definitely going to be in your revenue budget unless, of course, you're an exception, right? Your foundation prospects are going to be in, again, actual or confirmed, pending, and planned. Individuals. Now, individuals is a mixed category. And why do I say that? Because you have individuals, usually the larger, or not the larger donors, but the donors who make larger gifts, who may dedicate a gift to a specific project. And so, of course, on the individual line, you're going to include any donor and any gift where that is the case. But a lot of your lower level donors give to what our favorite category, unrestricted general operating support. Yay, right? And so it is legit to allocate a certain part of those individuals' giving that's not restricted, that is not dedicated to any particular project, to places where a little individual support comes in handy, is needed. Okay. There may be a dedicated event to this project. If that's the case, of course, 100% of the proceeds will go to it. If it's not, well, like individuals, if the event is not dedicated or advertised and promoted as benefiting a particular project, if it is only in support of the programs and services of your organization, you may allocate some of that event revenue towards this project, okay? Thinking about earned revenue for a shelter. What do y'all think? Are we going to have any or not? My guess would be not, because earned revenue tends to come from when it's in play, come from the patrons or the users of the facility or the services, right? Healthcare fees, again, tuition, all kinds of different earned revenue possibilities present themselves. But in the case of a shelter, it's not likely that there's going to be a lot of fees paid, that the shelter users, the clients, are going to be participating in giving revenue or spending revenue on the shelter. So there's probably not going to be any. Now, another thing to consider we talked about is the level of government services that are dependent on it, that are used, that are in play here. Remember that those are often reimbursable, almost always. So for a shelter, you might want to show that you have the cash to start up or to carry yourself along with this project until it was time to be able to bill the government agency, until those restrictions were lifted, right? Okay, any questions so far on revenue? Everybody awake out there? I know this can be a lot of information to throw out. So I hope that what we're doing is clear to everyone and we can go on. Okay. So those are the basic tenets of creating your budget. And a couple of tips I have for you based on my own budget experience and also teaching is that your budget and your narrative need to match. I can't and this is word to the wise and maybe doing something early and not the night before, although I know we all have that tendency. I, like anyone else, but you're probably going to write your narrative first, and you'll be much more clear on all the people that are needed, the supplies that are needed, the material, etc., in your narrative, and then forget to include them in your budget. And I've read many a proposal where, for example, we will have 3 program managers and a paraeducator and administrative support. And then you get to the budget and it's like program director. Okay, great. Where are the other 5 personnel? Right? So check that carefully. Have someone else read it and look it over if you can. Okay. And my last tip to you is that in your budget, costs, even small ones, should be included for planning, implementation, which we've discussed at length, and evaluation of your project. Now, if you don't, there's 2 pieces to this. People are like, well, we don't have a formal planning process. Well, you may have more than one than you know, right? I think it's fair to say that everyone at big budget time, when the organization does its a comprehensive annual budget, nearly everyone sits down and says, okay, Are we going to keep things the same? Are we going to do less? Are we going to do more? Are we going to expand? Are we going to serve different geographic areas? And any change you make is, first of all, is planning, right? So if this is as simple as a couple of meetings, that's okay. Make sure I personally allocate time for that among the staff. And also I split it out on the budget because you want your donor to see that your due diligence is happening, right? Implementation, we've talked about at length, and that's the who, when, where, and how of your project. And then evaluation. Okay, some folks come to me and say, we aren't going to do any evaluation. I say, well, any at all? Are you going to even survey your participants? Are you going to, count the number of clients that show up, and are you going to get anecdotal information for them as to whether or not the program helped them? It may be minimal, but I firmly believe that you want to include this in of course, your narrative and your budget, both for major donors and for grants, because they're going to want to know the result of their investment, right? They're going to want to know, did you have the desired effect? Did the change you wanted to see happen? Okay. And something to remember is that this can be something that you ask for funding for, especially for a donor who's really gung ho on it. If you don't have a lot of resources, you may ask, hey, we'd like to do this right. Would you consider funding a consultant to do this, to come in and evaluate for us, just as an example? Okay. Any questions on these tips? Are you all exhausted now? um, that is the end of the formal presentation. I want to point out these resources, and because I'm a budget and numbers geek, I got all excited and have them all up on my browser now to read through. If you're having to make a case to your funders about why supporting a full cost is important, this National Finance Fund article is great. Candid has a free introduction to project budgets course that you can do online at your own convenience that I put the link to here. And then this is one of the best cost analysis articles I've ever read in my life. It's excellent, not dry and boring, but really goes through step by step in detail how to put together the costs for your budget, including a lot of information on the steps to take for allocating your indirect costs. All this stuff is free. Go ahead and take advantage of it. If you can. I see there's a lot of the chat box is flashing, so I'm going to take a look. Okay. Can you give, and oh, by the way, yes, Susan, all these will be mailed to you, the PowerPoint slides and a link to the recording of this session, which is being produced now, will be emailed to you as soon as we have edited it and made it look really nice and pretty and gotten rid of the dog barking and all that. Well, I don't know, maybe Pujo can't get rid of the dog barking, but okay, so question, can you give a couple examples of how much you would include for evaluation as a small, newer nonprofit? Okay. Well, what would you say, like in the narrative, and how much would you include? Okay, well, the first thing I want to do is determine the changes I want to see. Okay, and that's a part of the goals section of your case statement or your narrative. So let's keep it simple. Let's say that we want to, let's see, so one of the programs I did at the Seattle Youth Symphony was bringing free music education into the schools. And what we wanted to see was the impact of arts education on reading and math test scores. So we hired an evaluator, and we didn't have a lot of money, of course, but this was important, and we knew that our other funders would want to see it. So we hired an evaluator, MEM evaluators, I believe is their name. But of course, we called them and said, okay, we've got this project. How would you recommend we evaluate it? they suggested the grades that we could get easily, so the cost wasn't too high, and then they interpreted them for us and kind of wrote up an evaluation report. So before we started applying for funding, we'd had this conversation and knew what their fees would be, and it was in the low 1000s. But say Suzanne or anyone you wanted to and had the data or whatever to survey. You could do a Survey Monkey thing, which would be a lot less expensive, right? You have to figure out what the goal of your evaluation is, the data that you want, the best way of getting that with a combination of not of living within your means, but also getting good data, and then make some phone calls or do some surfing online and say, okay, how much is this probably going to cost us? If you need some help with the evaluation contacts or whatever, you might want to check out 501 Commons. They have professional cadre or portfolio of evaluators in their volunteer or their consultant rosters, and there's some of them would be happy to speak with you about what a good guesstimate would be, right? Okay. Oh, thank you, Pujo. Does that answer your question, Suzanne? .501 Commons here. I will put that in the chat. I believe that this is the name of the organization, okay? They serve, okay, why is this not typing? Okay, 501 Commons or Washington nonprofits serve the state of Washington nonprofit community, and each of them has slightly different resources. Washington nonprofits is a lot more about advocacy, and 501 Commons is a lot more about providing tactical assistance to nonprofits. And they have resources at their website and as part of their, like I said, their portfolio of volunteers and low-cost consultants that can help you with some of these evaluation questions or go further into budgeting with you if if you need more information about that. So have a look for them online. They're great. And really, they exist to help the nonprofit sector. So don't be shy. Go ahead and give them a call. Other questions or comments? Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming. Happy Halloween. In November, we're going to be having a workshop about hiring as a development director. What to look for in a hire, using behavioral science to have a good interview and good questions. So that is the 19th of November, I believe. You'll get more information about it through your email. So thanks for joining us, and I'll hope to see you all in November. Thanks a lot.